From McCain Auditorium on the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network now presents a lecture by the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. Weinberger is the first speaker in this year's series of Landon Lectures on public issues. He is the 64th in the total series of Landon Lectures. The Secretary arrived in Manhattan shortly before 9 this morning to McCain Auditorium for a news conference, which was held in a TV studio in this building, and is now proceeding with the rest of the Landon Lecture party on the stage of this auditorium. The auditorium holding about 1,800 people and a capacity crowd for it. We'll switch now to the podium and the president of Kansas State University, Dr. Dwayne Ocko.
Good morning and welcome to the 65th Alfred M. Landon Lecture on Public Issues. It is my pleasure to introduce to you first the members of the platform party. First, Mr. Edward Seaton, who is chairperson of the Landon Patrons. Edward. Also on your right, Mr. Ken Hines, who is our student body president. And on your left, Dr. Charles Reagan, who is the chairperson of the Landon Lecture Series. This morning we are pleased to have with us the United States Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. Mr. Weinberger earned his baccalaureate degree, magna cum laude, in 1938 at Harvard University and was graduated from Harvard Law School in 1941. During World War II, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and advanced from the rank of private to captain. He saw action in the South Pacific and served on the intelligence staff of General Douglas MacArthur. Following the war, Mr. Weinberger returned to his native California and entered private law practice. During the time he served as a practicing attorney, Mr. Weinberger was the moderator of a weekly televised public affairs program, a staff book reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle, and a syndicated columnist. He served 3 consecutive terms in the California State Assembly, and in 1969, California Governor Ronald Reagan named him chairman of the Commission on State Government Organization and Economy, and later in 1970 appointed him State Director of Finance. At the federal level, Mr. Weinberger has distinguished himself as chairman of the Federal Trade Commission, director of the Office of Management and Budget, and as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. He was appointed Secretary of Defense in January of 1981. It is my pleasure to present to you Mr. Caspar Weinberger. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Very generous, very over-generous, very nice introduction, and I deeply appreciate it, as I deeply appreciate very much the honor of being invited to participate in this very distinguished lecture series. It honors again a very distinguished American statesman and a renowned son of canvas, and I have great nostalgia in thinking about the governor, Governor Landon, because in 1936, when he was nominated to run for president, while I was too young to cast a ballot, I did a couple of other things. I attended the convention that nominated him. It was my first convention. I attended not as a delegate, of course, but as an usher. And I had another very interesting experience just a few weeks ago, and I was talking to the National Urban League because they were meeting in the same hall in Cleveland that nominated, where Governor Landon was nominated. And it was interesting indeed to contrast it with the halls now required for national conventions. And it was also, after the euphoria of leaving that convention, that it seemed to me that with all the support that went to a candidate of that kind, of course he couldn't possibly lose. And so I went one step farther and placed a few wagers on his election. And it was, of course, the last time I've ever bet on anything. I still think he would have made a very fine president. I have promised my vote to someone else this year, but he has given the country not only very great service, but a great senator, Nancy Caspar, who has done and is doing a wonderful job in Washington today. And I know that they have given the state enormously fine service too over the years. Well, I'd like to talk today about something you probably wouldn't really expect to hear from someone who is supposed to be in charge of the Pentagon, and that is arms reduction. President Reagan is frequently criticized for being the first president not to have concluded some form of arms control agreement. And I suggest, however, that he will be known for something far more important and far more historic, and I believe he will be the first president who will achieve real arms reductions, not just a codification of higher arms ceilings. Reliable verification is, of course, essential, but and that should be part of the agreement too, and we haven't had that. And the other thing that is essential is that agreements not be ambiguous or have such sometimes designedly obscure provisions that enforcement or even knowledge of a violation can raise a very difficult legal question. And it should give mutual stability, and there should not be anything resembling a one-sided arms race. And most of all, they shouldn't be agreements which permit expansion. And unfortunately, that's essentially what we've had. It seems to be arms control and the arms control process, while entirely praiseworthy and something that we have to enter into and should enter into, has produced many disappointments in the past decades. I'm encouraged that we've learned the lessons of the past and that we will be applying them today. So I'd like to talk really about what we have learned from these past arms control experiences and why we're somewhat more optimistic about the future. As a native of California, and I'm of course required by our Constitution to be optimistic, but I really am about this. I do think that we will have a far better result and series of results in the years ahead. It will take time, it'll take patience. But our goal isn't just to conclude an arms control agreement. We've done that. It might be considered politically expedient to some to do that, but really, if all the American people wanted and needed was just a treaty or an agreement and a lot of fanfare that accompanies the signing in the East Room of the White House or wherever, we could have done that long ago. But having a treaty that is equitable, is verifiable, and most of all requires real reductions is a very difficult thing. It's much more difficult, and yes, we have not yet achieved it. And those who cry out for a treaty or any treaty really confuse ways and means. For them, arms control or an agreement is the whole end in and of itself. Arms reductions are really the means to a very important end, however, which is peace and stability. And that goal is very important to me. It's obviously enormously important to President Reagan. I've had the great privilege of knowing him and working with him now for about 20 years, and I know that there's nothing that he wants more than to try to secure a genuine, verifiable, and sharp reduction in arms of all kinds. We have chosen peace not because we're one party or another. We've chosen peace because we're Americans and a civilized people. And war prevents people from leading the kinds of lives that our country was fashioned to protect and to enhance. And as civilized people, we reject war because it kills and maims soldiers and civilians alike. And most of all, it undermines the fabric of a free people. Nuclear war is the most horrible form of war. The President has said many times a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. It is so terrible, in fact, that the temptation is strong for a number of people to turn their backs on the whole subject. Grim as they are, these matters have to be thought about and dealt with, and it is, of course, part of my task as Secretary of Defense to face that grim reality every day and to know how best we may prevent such a catastrophe from occurring. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, we followed two paths to try to prevent that catastrophe: deterrence and arms control. And so long as I'm Secretary of Defense, we will certainly continue to follow both of those paths to peace. And there's another path that I also want to talk about a little later that I think can offer even greater hope to all of us. I'd like to focus, first of all, on the efforts that we've made to control and reduce nuclear weapons. We are trying to regain our deterrent capability, and we're doing that, I think. Indeed, we have to, because we did have, after all, a whole decade, the decade of the 70s, in which investment in our arms and our military declined by over 20%, and that was at a time when the Soviets were expanding at an enormous rate, the second decade of their expansion. But on arms control, our efforts were begun really many, many years ago, back in 1946, by a famous American, Bernard Baruch. He offered the world in 1946 the first plan to ban nuclear weapons. And he said that peace is never long preserved by the weight of metal or by an armament race. Peace can be made tranquil and secure only by understanding and by agreement fortified by sanctions. To the members of the United Nations earlier this week, President Reagan proposed to build on that, on all of that understanding and ways to build on the lessons that we've learned from the past. And here I would like to talk about how we can create that second half of Baruch's formulation, agreements fortified by sanctions. Unfortunately, in the past, we've really, I think, not asked enough of arms control agreements. We have what many hold up to be a model of successful negotiations. That's the strategic arms limitation talks, the SALT talks of the 60s and 70s. Some of our finest statesmen participated in those negotiations. It took us 2.5 years to reach an interim agreement with the Soviets, which was SALT I. It took 7 more years until we got SALT II, and they lasted really a little over 10 years. They spanned the terms of 3 presidents, those negotiations. The SALT II agreement was badly flawed. It was withdrawn by President Carter from the Senate after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. But surprisingly, President Reagan is criticized for not reaching an agreement during his first term. Again, it isn't an agreement. What did those agreements that we took over 10 years to negotiate, what did they really bring us? If they had been an effective means of reducing or constraining nuclear arsenals, it wouldn't have been necessary for President Reagan to conclude any agreement. But those treaties, those SALT treaties, permitted, indeed provided for, a massive expansion and modernization of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. When SALT I was signed in 1972, the Soviets had about 2,300 strategic weapons. When SALT II was signed in 1979, their arsenal had more than doubled. By then they had 5,500 strategic weapons, and today, after that agreement was signed and after they have said they would continue to observe it, they have over 8,800 strategic warheads. And they could continue increasing to 8,600 more ICBMs and well over 5,000 submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads, all of it which would have been fully permitted by the SALT II treaty. And all during this time, incidentally, we've made major reductions in our strategic arsenals. We're trying to modernize, but we have made overall net reductions, and we're committed to further reductions as a result of a NATO agreement reached in a meeting that I attended with the NATO defense ministers in Canada last year. We're committed to another 1,500 withdrawal. President Reagan said last year at the United Nations, peace cannot be served by pseudo-arms control. And that is why the President has sought treaties that do dramatically reduce nuclear arms and not just limit their growth. And in the Defense Department, I'm trying to get away from the use of the term arms control because it has resulted in these things that do not control really and do not reduce. And we talk now only about arms reduction. Our first position in the START negotiations, that is the strategic range negotiations, we sought drastic reductions there. The President asked for a 50% cut in strategic ballistic missiles and a 1/3 cut in their warheads, significant reductions in the ballistic missile throw weight. But the Soviets apparently thought we were too ambitious, or perhaps they wanted to keep on expanding their own nuclear arsenal. One way or another, they wouldn't agree to that, and we tried other ways. We tried to be flexible. We tried not to be rigid. We made 10 different proposals. We changed the START proposals 10 times. And we relaxed these proposals. We suggested trade-offs. We suggested a build-down concept that linked reductions to modernization, leading to a more stable balance of forces. The core of our proposal, a one-third reduction in strategic missile warheads, remains intact. And then in the intermediate range talks, the shorter range missiles that were involved in the NATO deployments, President Reagan proposed a zero option. Before we deployed anything on the intermediate range at all, and the Soviet count was well over 350 to nothing, this president proposed no deployment by us at all, but obviously taking out the Soviet weapons and bringing us all down to zero. Again, they said no, and we suggested then limiting at equal levels, trying to reach zero over a period of time. Well, what happened? Soviets walked out of both negotiations. They've stayed away. Those negotiations have been taking place for 10 months. You can't negotiate when you're the only one in the room. And as President Reagan has repeated over and over, we will continue and do continue to stand ready to negotiate on any proposal that will lead to genuine and equitable and verifiable arms reductions. And in looking forward to his meeting with Soviet Union Foreign Minister Gromyko tomorrow, President Reagan said, one of my highest priorities is finding ways to reduce the level of arms and improve our working relationship with the Soviet Union. And we do stand ready to confer, to compromise, as long as we don't compromise basic principles. And we know the Soviets are very difficult and tough and tenacious negotiators, and that they can be counted on, of course, to pursue any advantage that they can. Sometimes their attitude seems to be what's mine is mine and what's yours is negotiable. We're going to overlook all of that, because what we want is to secure agreements that produce a genuine improvement in conditions, a genuine verifiable reduction. Some claim that the Soviet regime will never agree to fair and balanced arms accords, and it's futile to pursue arms reductions, but I think this is not true. I think that, first of all, we want to make the effort, and secondly, we have to make the effort. The President told the United Nations just a couple of days ago in New York how much progress we made, and at what pace, I cannot say. But we have a moral obligation to try and to try again, and we will fulfill that. Looking back on a number of missed opportunities for arms reduction over the years, and many others that have occurred, many of these missed opportunities have occurred, we've learned much about negotiating with the Soviets, and we're trying to apply that experience. We've learned the value of patiently continuing a dialogue, never giving up on negotiations, nor signing a hasty agreement of no real value just to put an end to the sometimes frustrating discussions, and they can be very frustrating. We've learned that the Soviets respect strength, and that's why this administration does not subscribe to the illusion of a freeze while we are still trying to restore our strategic deterrent. We've also learned the importance of writing treaties with precise language, treaties that cannot easily be broken, and treaties without loopholes. Sometimes, in order to get an agreement, treaty makers have indulged in what might be called calculated ambiguities. And they may work for the first weeks or months or even first years because they do enable a piece of paper to be signed. But if the ambiguities are such that neither side has really agreed, you can't paper that over. And so what we want is very precise language, and obviously treaties that don't have loopholes, can't be easily broken, and frankly do not require large batteries of attorneys to interpret. It's insurance, it is to ensure arms reduction, that these arms reductions are entered into, that they are then kept and honored, and that loopholes are not exploited or aren't even present. All of these reasons require that we insist on strong verification. Verification is a major concern given the record of Soviet non-compliance with some existing treaties and Soviet behavior generally. So because of all these reasons, we feel we must have effective verification, and we offer them effective verification, because that's the only way we can make these agreements effective. We recently tabled a proposal in the chemical weapons negotiations that I think demonstrates the importance that we place on effective verification. We made an unprecedented offer to accept and require challenge inspections on a 24-hour notice of any militarily owned or government-controlled facility to verify compliance with the treaty. They could come look at ours, we should be able to go look at theirs. We must remember we can never banish the knowledge of weapons, chemical or nuclear or any weapons for that matter. But science, the same science that produced nuclear weapons, does offer us the hope that we could eliminate some of the consequences of that knowledge. And that really brings me to the third of these ways to try to keep the peace: deterrent strength, arms reduction agreements, and the Strategic Defense Initiative. And that's what we've embarked upon as a research program to try to develop a thoroughly reliable defense against incoming Soviet missiles. A defense that could, if it can be developed, and we don't have it yet, but we have all of our inventive genius and our productive skills and scientific abilities that have given us a lot of these things in the past. If we can develop this thoroughly reliable defense, then I think we will have gone very far toward removing the perils and the dangers and the risks of these systems. We would look forward to that day when we could supplement these other two methods of keeping the peace with this kind of deterrent that would be based on a thoroughly reliable and effective strategic defense. This, in effect, would give us the ability to have a system which destroyed weapons and not people. In objecting to this Strategic Defense Initiative, many critics claim that a strategic defense system must be guaranteed to be 100% effective before it should even be considered. But to prove the potential of a defensive deterrent, which is certainly one of the goals of our research, we need to show that first, we can make the success of any attack by an adversary too uncertain for him to hazard aggression, and that can add to our deterrent. And if we can do that, we will have succeeded in meeting a good part of the President's challenge of restoring and rendering ballistic missiles obsolete. And the repercussions for humanity, I think, will be enormously positive. While the Strategic Defense Initiative can strengthen deterrence by reducing the military utility of these missiles, it can also enhance the opportunity for arms reduction. I know there are a lot of people who contend that strategic defense will threaten arms control. They do not, I think, really appreciate the fact that by devaluing nuclear ballistic missiles, we can create a very powerful incentive for sharp reductions in their numbers, reductions that would enhance the security of the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union. And these critics also claim that the strategic defense program will violate the ICBM treaty. I don't think they understand the treaty or our program, because the treaty permits research, and ours is a research program now. And I don't think they recognize that the Soviets have been conducting similar research since the 1960s, and that is one of the critical driving factors behind the Strategic Defense Initiative. If the Soviets, with all of their research at work as it has been since roughly 1967, were to develop such a system first, then this would be a far more perilous and risky world. And it is important to bear in mind that they have been working on it. They have an ABM system of somewhat less effective kind already deployed around Moscow, and that deployment was perfectly legal under the treaty. But they also are in the process of constructing a major early warning radar of a type and in a location that is forbidden by the treaty. And so we seek to make sure that we might be able to develop, could develop this kind of thoroughly reliable defensive system. We know it'll take a lot of time to do it. We know we don't have it now. We know we can do parts of it now. But we think that if we can do it, would allow some future president to deploy a system that would render these incoming weapons obsolete and impotent, and that it would enhance stability and our own safety and the safety of the world. If this program is successful, and I'm confident will be, though I know it will take a long time, then we'd be able, through a combination of new technology and new arms reduction measures, to create a world that is far safer and far more stable than the present one. Strategic defenses offer, in short, the possibility of added deterrence, added security, and get us away from some of the problems of verification. Some argue that if these very deep reductions took place, then the side capable of hiding, for example, even 1,000 warheads might be able to blackmail or disarm its opponent. But if they knew that those 1,000 warheads were impotent and obsolete, there'd be a lot less reason for them either to try to violate an agreement or to make verification be frustrated. Well, these major arms reduction and strategic defense proposals are clearly a challenge to the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom is all against them, and all I can say is that this would not be the first time that President Reagan has challenged the conventional wisdom and rather successfully many times, and frequently found that the conventional wisdom isn't all that wise. We have to study this. We have to continue to work on it. We cannot be shackled by the conventional wisdom to systems which clearly are not reducing the tensions and the perils of the world. And we will continue into the future on the course we've set, and our negotiations may not yield the results we want, but we will keep immediately. We will keep on with them. We want the Soviets to have an incentive to reach these agreements. And that's why we must continue with our program to restore our deterrent forces, hard and unpopular and expensive as it is, because we know if we stop now, after only 4 years of effort to recover from 10 years of neglect, we would be sending a very clear signal to Moscow. We would really be telling them that they've no reason whatever to reach an agreement with us, any agreement that required reduction of weapons, because they would know that we would accommodate them by reducing or not regaining our own strength unilaterally, and there's no reason whatever for them to agree to reduce theirs. We also have to pursue these promising areas of technology, such as the Strategic Defense Initiative, these things that offer such great hope with appropriate arms control efforts for a far safer world than we have today. As with all great quests and searches for something better down through history, there are the cynics and the naysayers who say we've embarked on an impossible task. And I'd answer that very simply with your own Kansas motto, ad aspera per aspera, to the stars through adversity. I think we can get to the stars. We have in the past many times, literally and figuratively. And it seems to me today that the important thing is that open discussion can sweep away the despair, and science can find the key to stability. And so I hope we can all resolve, Kansans and Americans and free men and women everywhere, to join the most noble quest of all, which is, of course, the pursuit of peace with freedom. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The Secretary has about 10 minutes for questions, and we have microphones arranged to your right and to your left. And we'll try to handle the questions alternately from these locations. Is there a question ready on the left side of the auditorium?
I was impressed by, Mr. Secretary, I was impressed by your claims that we need to restore, or as you say, regain our deterrent capabilities, because in the 1970s, we more or less sat on our hands while the Soviets expanded their arsenal. How do you reconcile this claim with the public fact that during the 1970s, the United States roughly doubled the number of nuclear warheads aimed at the Soviet Union from around 4,500 to 9,000 or more? It's true that the Soviets expanded their arsenal in the 70s, but it's also true that we did the same with ours. And how you can call that years of neglect or sitting on our hands or whatever is beyond me. I'd like to ask another question, if I may.
Perhaps I should try to answer that one first, and then we'll try the others. I think what we have to bear in mind here is what are we talking about in the way of very specific definitions? We made additions to the battlefield nuclear weapons, those of short range. We left a lot of the earlier ones there that were basically obsolete, or their launching systems were no longer effective. And as I mentioned, we have made major reductions since 1972 in all of our arsenals, not just for economy reasons or anything of the kind, but because there were more effective ways to help defend the United States. But you can't neglect the strategic defenses, the strategic triad, and that is what the area in which we have to regain our strength, and are regaining our strength. We have the three parts of the triad. the B-52 bombers, which are now over 26 years old and not really able to penetrate Soviet defenses effectively. We had the Minuteman missiles, which do not have the accuracy or the yield necessary to destroy Soviet hardened targets. And this hardening has taken place since the SALT treaties in many cases. And we do not have the submarines with the missiles that have the accuracy and the yield to do the same thing. We're getting that now. We will have all of those if the Congress permits us to continue. That will not result in an addition to a number of warheads. Counting raw warheads is a very unrealistic way of examining the relative strengths of the countries. These are the equations that, as I say, I have to balance up and cast up every day. And it is essential that we have modern and deliverable systems. And the reason it's essential is that if we don't, we may find ourselves in a terribly dangerous position. And if we do, we have the best hope of never having to use them.
A question from the right side of the auditorium.
Secretary, you mentioned how terrible war is, that it kills and maims people, and the war we have in mind right now is the Iran-Iraq war, and it seems that it would be in the interest of humanity to end that war and all other wars. Have there been any real and sincere efforts on by your side to try to end that war?
Which war?
Israeli.
No, the Iran-Iraq war.
Oh, the Iran-Iraq war. We have certainly tried to do what we could about stopping the flow of arms from various people in our own country as well as from other countries. And you're quite right. That is a very terrible potential conflict. It's already taken thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives. And two armies, approximately 500,000 each, face each other across a very narrow front. And it could be one of the worst battles really since the Battle of the Somme in World War I. So yes, we are doing everything we can in the way of trying to reduce the flow of arms and counseling and urging through the United Nations and all of the other available organizations that war should not continue. Again, it's a little difficult with the relationships that we have or don't have actually with Iran, but we continue to make every effort because I agree with you that that is a potentially, it's already been a war that's caused enormous losses, and the potential battles that could continue from that war are terrible indeed to contemplate.
Question from the left.
And most of his advisors have opposed every arms control treaty that's ever been negotiated in the past. Furthermore, the Strategic Defense Initiative that you propose, although, as you say, research in these systems does not violate any of the treaties, if the United States ever tries to deploy these systems, they will violate the SALT I ABM agreement, they will violate the outer space ban on nuclear weapons, and maybe even violate the atmospheric test ban treaty if they try to test the system. In view of that, why should everybody take seriously the President's claims that he now wishes to stop the arms race?
Well, I thought I'd try to answer both of those during the talk, but I'll be glad to try again. We have criticized a lot of the existing treaties because we don't feel that they reduced or required reduction of arms. We feel that they permitted expansion. Some say at a slightly slower rate than might otherwise have taken place, but enormous expansion. And we don't think that that has served the cause of peace. It certainly has not removed the dangers of war, and we think that agreements should do that, and that we should work for agreements that do that, and not agreements that arouse a lot of unfulfilled expectations and don't result in the reduction of arms. On the Strategic Defense Initiative, there is no violation of the treaty while it is a research program, and that is what it necessarily has to be now, since we do not have yet developed the capability to deploy such a system. But bear in mind also the point I made, and that is that the Soviets are working not only on research on this, but they have already deployed an anti-satellite system, and they have developed to a substantial extent and done a lot of the research work necessary to produce a system that could, if they bring it to fruition, render our missiles unusable. And that would be, I think, a very much more dangerous world, a very much more perilous world in which to exist. So we do it because we think it offers a very much greater hope to mankind. If you can have a weapon which destroys weapons and not people, and which, as the President has very well said, a system which would enable us to protect our people and not avenge them, then I think we have an obligation and a duty to proceed, and that's exactly what we're doing. But of course, with the Soviets doing it too, we have more than that. We have an imperative to proceed.
Question on the right. And I think this probably should be the last question. Yes.
Yes, Mr. Secretary. Really quickly, back, I think it was the late 1950s when there was talk about putting men in space or satellites in space. Here in the United States, and Congress was going back and forth, you know, could we not do it? And no one thought it was possible. And in the meantime, the Soviet Union, who we thought were a backward country, were busy working on this. My concern is, and in the meantime, when we were debating back and forth in Congress whether to do it or not, they sent a satellite up, made us look stupid or ridiculous. My concern is today, this, I'm having a question specifically in deterrence concerning laser weapons. Today, reading in the newspapers that congressmen don't think this is possible, it's unrealistic, you know, we don't have the technology. My concern is, will history repeat itself? Will they again, the Russians are working on it, will they again beat us to this, have this weapon, as you said, which would be a danger, and to us would be invaluable? I guess my bottom line is, do you believe that we're putting enough technology into it? Are we putting a lot of work into it? And is there awareness in Congress that this has happened before? You know, we've been fooled by ourselves. Is there enough being put into it?
It's a very good question. You never know, really, if you are doing enough. We're doing what seems to us to be the best and most effective pace for the research. We want to produce results, and we're looking at a number of different systems. And incidentally, the systems we're looking at to destroy these incoming Soviet missiles are non-nuclear systems. They're systems that would not destroy nuclear missiles with nuclear missiles. They're systems that would do it by different means. And we are putting very substantial amounts, in excess of $2 billion this year if the Congress approves it. And it will require more in later years. Whatever it requires will be far less than the cost of the offensive systems that we put in since the dawn of the nuclear age, and far less cost than we would have to spend to modernize those systems. So if we are able to do it from every point of view, it would offer not only much greater hope, but a far better way of preserving the peace. And we intend to continue just as long as we're authorized to do it. I think the pace is about right now in view of what we know and what we hope we can learn. I think it will necessarily, if as things go along we have the results we hope for, will require more. But again, it will be less than the offensive systems. It is vital to keep it up. And you're absolutely right, the Soviets are putting a very large amount of resources into it, and they don't have the limitations on resources that we do, in the sense of that they're perfectly willing to sacrifice their economy and the quality of life in order to gain military advantage. So it is essential that we do what we're doing, and I believe the pace is about right. I think it will be, but there is always the problem of getting the necessary support for a new departure, something that does, frankly, fly in the face of the conventional wisdom. There are some members of the Congress and the Senate who are strongly for this, who are caught up by the vision of the future that it offers. And there are many who feel that the conventional wisdom is the only one that should be followed. And the struggle will be along those lines in the next few years. In this year's budget, if it is passed by the Congress, we will have a substantial amount, but it's always a very hair-raising and I guess you might say exciting time to find out how it is going to come out. And we hope we've made our arguments sufficiently persuasive so that the amounts that are now in will be carried all the way through. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, the applause expresses to you our sincere thanks. We are adjourned.
You're listening to a lecture and a question and answer period with the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, speaking in the Landon Lecture Series on public issues here at Kansas State University. The Secretary was originally scheduled for a broadcast interview following this and to have lunch with the Landon Lecture patrons, but both of those were canceled this morning. The Secretary saying he has to get back to Washington. As a matter of fact, even this Landon Lecture period is a bit short. As you heard President Walker indicate, Secretary Weinberger had only about 10 minutes to take questions and answers. Our network facilities this morning